It was the kind of night where even the stars seemed to look down with pity. Veiled behind thin clouds that rolled lazily over the small, western town of Dry Creek, the air was heavy with silence, the kind that clung to the skin and made every creak of wood and distant howl of coyote sound louder than it should. Sheriff Nathaniel Cole, a man whose shoulders had borne the weight of the badge longer than most, sat in his dimly lit office, staring absently at the half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. His fingers brushed the brim of his hat on the desk, his mind always straying to memories he wished he could bury but never quite could. His wife's laughter still lingered in the quietest corners of his memory, though the grave outside town had long since swallowed her smile. The ache in his chest was a constant companion, though he wore it with the same quiet endurance he wore his gun belt. Life had taught him that grief wasn't something to outlive. It was something you learned to live beside. And just as he tipped the glass to his lips, the door to his office creaked open with a hesitant push, and standing in the threshold was a girl no more than 17, her dress tattered at the hem, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and stubborn defiance. She looked like she'd been running for miles, her shoes coated in dust, her thin frame trembling though she tried to steady herself. Sheriff Cole rose slowly, the instinct of duty snapping him upright even as curiosity lit his weary eyes. "Evening," he said, his voice low, steady, the kind that could calm a frightened horse. "You lost?" The girl swallowed hard, clutching the strap of a worn satchel slung over her shoulder. For a long moment she didn't speak, as if weighing whether to run back into the night or stand her ground. Finally, in a voice roughened by exhaustion, she whispered, No one came to claim me." Sheriff Cole frowned, confused by the words, but before he could press her further, her knees buckled, and she collapsed right there on the floor of his office. With a muttered curse, he set aside his glass, moved swiftly and knelt beside her. The weight of her body was shockingly light as he lifted her into the spare cot at the back of the room, covering her with the blanket his late wife had stitched years ago. He studied her face under the flicker of lantern light, young, worn from the road, eyes shadowed by things no one that age should have carried. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but something in his chest stirred, something he hadn't felt since before the grave swallowed his heart whole, and so began the night that would change not just her fate, but his as well. Morning in Dry Creek came with the sound of wagons creaking down the dirt street and roosters crowing in distant barns. Sheriff Cole had dozed in the chair beside the cot, his hat tipped low, his hand resting near his gun as if even in sleep he could not put down the mantle of protector, when the girl stirred, blinking against the shafts of sunlight spilling through the blinds. She looked around like a trapped animal. "Easy," Cole said, rising slowly. "You're safe here." She pulled the blanket closer around her shoulders, mistrust etched into every line of her face. "Where am I?" "Sheriff's office," he replied. "Name's Nathaniel Cole. Folks call me Nate. You wandered in last night. Near fell on my floor. Lucky thing I was still awake." She hesitated, then whispered, "Clara, my name's Clara." The name felt fragile, as though spoken aloud it might shatter. Cole nodded. "Clara, you got kin nearby?" Her eyes darted to the floorboards. A long silence stretched before she said almost bitterly, "No, no one." Cole studied her carefully. She wasn't lying, at least not entirely. He recognized the hollow look of someone who had known too much loss too soon. It mirrored the man in the mirror he saw every morning. He poured a tin cup of water and handed it to her. She took it, hands trembling as though the weight of simple kindness was heavier than the satchel she carried. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded, so he fetched bread and jerky from his cupboard, setting it on the desk. She devoured it with a hunger that spoke louder than words. When she finally slowed, eyes wary, she asked, "Why are you helping me?" Cole leaned back against the desk, folding his arms across his chest. "Because no one else did." Clara stayed silent, chewing on both food and thought. Sheriff Cole knew enough to give her time. He wasn't a man to pry unless the law demanded it, but his gut told him this girl carried a story soaked in more than just dust and hunger. By noon, she had drifted into restless sleep again, and Cole found himself staring out the window at townsfolk going about their lives, merchants shouting prices, children laughing, horses clopping down the street. It was a town that moved forward each day, no matter how many graves it dug, and he wondered if Clara could find a place among them, or if she would vanish into the wind like so many lost souls before her. That night, over supper at his own modest cabin on the edge of town, he finally asked, "What brought you here, Clara?" She sat at the wooden table, the lantern's glow flickering across her young face. For a long time she didn't answer. Then she said, voice low, "I was on the orphan train. They unloaded us at the station, lined us up for folks to choose. Families came one by one, picking the ones they wanted. But when the train left, no one had chosen me." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she bit her lip hard as though punishing herself for the crack in her armor. Cole's chest tightened. He'd heard of the orphan trains, how children from crowded eastern cities were shipped west, paraded for strangers who might take them in. It was supposed to be salvation. Too often it was just another kind of abandonment. Clara's eyes met his then, fierce despite the tears threatening. So I walked away. Walked until my feet bled. I told myself I didn't need anyone. But last night, I didn't know where else to go. Cole let the silence stretch, heavy with the truth of her story. Finally, he said, voice steady, "Well, you found here, and I reckon that counts for something." He didn't tell her that in that moment, watching her fight to hold herself together. He felt something he hadn't felt in years, a reason to care again. Days passed and Clara remained under his roof. Word spread quickly through Dry Creek that the sheriff had taken in a stray orphan, and the townsfolk whispered. Some with sympathy, others with suspicion. Cole ignored them. He gave Clara chores, feeding the hens, sweeping the porch, helping cook. She did them without complaint, as though the structure itself was a lifeline. At night he heard her weep quietly, thinking he could not hear. And though he never said a word, the sound carved into him, reminding him of nights he had sat alone by his wife's empty chair. The bond between them grew not from words, but from the simple rhythm of shared survival. And when one evening Clara asked, voice tentative, "Why are you still letting me stay?" "You don't even know me," Cole answered simply, "because sometimes knowing someone ain't about their past. It's about giving them a future." And that was when Clara's tears fell freely, not from pain this time, but from the unfamiliar weight of belonging. She didn't know if she would stay in Dry Creek forever. She didn't know if she deserved to. But for the first time in her young life, she felt like she wasn't invisible. And for Sheriff Nathaniel Cole, long hardened by grief, Clara's presence was a reminder that even broken things could fit together and make something whole. Little did they know, forces beyond the town's borders would soon test that fragile sense of home, threatening to tear it apart before it had the chance to truly begin. The days in Dry Creek rolled forward with the steady rhythm of wagon wheels, sunrises bleeding into sunsets. But inside Sheriff Nathaniel Cole's cabin, a quieter story was unfolding, one of fragile trust, unspoken healing, and a strange kind of family that neither he nor Clara had expected. Yet shadows always wait for light to grow strong enough to be worth dimming, and trouble was brewing beyond the horizon. It came first as whispers in the saloon, carried on the dry wind from neighboring towns, a gang of drifters, mean-eyed men who had taken to robbing, stagecoaches and leaving trails of fear behind them, were headed toward Dry Creek. Sheriff Cole knew it was only a matter of time before they arrived, and he doubled his patrols, his presence a silent reassurance to townsfolk who had long relied on his steady hand. Clara, though, noticed the lines deepening on his face, the way his hand lingered longer on the butt of his revolver, and she asked him one evening as she swept the porch, "Are we in danger?" Cole paused in the act of oiling his rifle, looking at her, this girl, who had been discarded by the world but somehow had become the center of his. He wanted to shield her from everything, but he also knew truth was kinder than false comfort. "There's always danger," he said quietly. "But I aim to make sure it don't find you." She nodded, trusting him in a way that shook him to his core, for trust was a currency he hadn't thought he'd ever earn again. It wasn't long before the danger arrived in the form of 3 men riding into town at dusk, their silhouettes framed by a blood-red sunset. Dust rose behind their horses like smoke, and when they tied their mounts outside the saloon, every eye in Dry Creek followed. Sheriff Cole was there, leaning against the hitching post, hat brim low, voice calm but firm as he greeted them. "Evening, gentlemen. You just passing through?" The leader, a scar-faced man with eyes like flint, sneered. "Maybe, maybe not. Depends on the welcome." The tension between them was like the taut string of a fiddle ready to snap. Clara, watching from the safety of the sheriff's office window, clutched the wooden sill so hard her knuckles whitened. She had never seen violence firsthand, but she had seen enough rejection to recognize menace when it walked into town. Cole held his ground, refusing to let fear take root. Welcome's fair as long as you play by the rules. No trouble, no blood. That's how we keep things in Dry Creek. The scar-faced man smirked, but his eyes promised storm clouds. We'll see about that. And just like that, the gang sauntered into the saloon, leaving the town holding its breath. That night, Clara sat by the fire, her voice small when she asked, "Why do men like that come here? Why do they take when others are just trying to live?" Sheriff Cole looked into the flames, their dance reminding him of every battle he had fought, every grave he had dug. "Because some men think the world owes them," he said, softly. "But it don't. Not to them, not to us. We only owe each other the chance to do right." Clara stared at him, the firelight painting her face in gold, and for the first time she realized that the sheriff's strength wasn't in the gun at his side. It was in the way he carried pain, without letting it turn him cruel. She whispered, "You're not like them." He gave a humorless chuckle. "I'm not as different as you think. I just chose another road." What he didn't tell her was that he wasn't sure how long he could walk that road alone. The following days tested that path. The drifters made their presence known, loud voices in the saloon, drunken boasts, a fistfight or two that ended with bruised locals and smug laughter. Sheriff Cole broke them up, threw them in the cells overnight, but each time they emerged bolder. As though daring him to push harder, Clara saw the burden weigh on him, saw the way he tried to keep his shoulders squared for the sake of the town. One evening, after patching a scrape on his hand from breaking up another fight, she asked, "Do you ever get tired of carrying everyone's safety on your shoulders?" He looked at her then, and the honesty in his tired eyes made her breath hitch. "Every day. But that's the job. And sometimes, it's the only thing that keeps me from falling apart." She reached out then, hesitantly, placing her small hand over his calloused one. "You're not alone," she whispered. For a moment the cabin was silent but for the crackle of firewood, and in that silence Sheriff Cole felt something shift, a crack in the armor he had worn since his wife's death, a reminder that maybe, just maybe, life still had something left to give. But shadows don't sit idle. One night while the town slept, the drifters struck. They raided the general store, pistol-whipped the owner, and made off with supplies. Sheriff Cole was woken by frantic pounding at his door, Clara's frightened eyes meeting his as he buckled his gun belt. "Stay inside," he ordered firmly, though every instinct in her screamed to follow. She watched from the window as he rode out into the night, lantern light flickering on the horizon as men gathered to pursue the outlaws. The hours crawled by, and Clara sat by the cold ashes of the fire, clutching the sheriff's spare hat in her lap, praying to a god she wasn't sure listened. When dawn finally broke and hooves thundered back into town, she ran to the street, her heart lodging in her throat. Sheriff Cole was there, dust-streaked and weary, blood on his sleeve but alive. He had caught two of the gang. The leader had escaped into the hills. Clara nearly collapsed with relief, and when Cole dismounted, she rushed to him, forgetting her usual guardedness, throwing her arms around him. For a moment he froze, unaccustomed to such open need, but then his arms wrapped around her, firm and protective as though she belonged there. In that embrace, something wordless was forged between them. Not father and daughter, not strangers, but two broken souls daring to piece together something like family. The town, too, began to see it, how the sheriff, once withdrawn and gruff, now walked with a steadier step. How the orphan girl, once invisible, now carried her head a little higher. And though danger still lurked, though the scar-faced man still plotted his revenge, there was a new strength in Dry Creek, born not from law or bullets, but from the fragile, powerful bond between a widowed sheriff and a girl who had been left behind by everyone else, and sometimes that kind of bond was the strongest shield of all.